4 minutes and 38 seconds. That is the entire length of the recording, and for 47 of those seconds the seeker holds lock on a single dark shape, low against a moonless black sea. The vessel does not maneuver, it does not light up. It runs at a steady 8 knots on a southern heading, 12 nautical miles below the Kerch approaches, and it has no idea that the warm green smear riding its wake is closing at better than 40 knots. At 4:12 in the morning the thermal frame fills white, the feed ends, and lashed to the aft deck, frozen in the last clean frame before impact, sit two cylindrical objects the Russian Ministry of Defense would later call fishing gear. They are not the right shape for fishing gear. What they actually were and why Moscow needed you to believe otherwise is the whole of this story. Pretension_checkpoint 030 hook resolution tease. To understand what we are looking at, you have to understand why a Russian auxiliary tug is moving cargo in the dark in the first place. By the spring of 2026, the Black Sea had become the one theater where Ukraine, a country with no functioning navy of its own, had reversed a fleet that outweighed it by every conventional measure. The instrument of that reversal was not a ship. It was a 5.5-meter unmanned surface vessel called the Magura V5, a low fiberglass hull packed with batteries and a warhead, steered by satellite link, riding so low in the water that radar struggles to separate it from chop. Open-source reporting and Ukraine's own military intelligence directorate, the HUR, put its range past 800 kilometers and its dash speed above 40 knots. By the time of the engagement in this footage, vessels of this class had been credited, in claims widely reported and in several cases corroborated by satellite imagery, with damaging or sinking a string of Russian warships, among them the patrol ship Sergei Kotov in March 2024 and the landing ship Caesar Kunikov before it. The cumulative effect was simple and measurable. The fleet stopped sailing in daylight, and it largely stopped sailing near the western Black Sea at all. So the traffic moved at night, and it moved close to the Crimean coast, hugging the protection of shore-based air defense and the assumption that darkness was cover. That assumption is the first thing this tape destroys. A FLIR seeker does not care about the moon. It reads heat. And a diesel tug, engine running warm, deck gear radiating the day's stored sun back into a cold sea, lights up on thermal like a struck match. The crew that night was relying on the one thing the Magura had quietly taken away from them. They were relying on the dark. Here is where the public record stops being clean and where this investigation actually begins. The footage we are working from did not arrive with a chain of custody. It surfaced first as a 40-second clip on a Ukrainian-aligned Telegram channel, then as a longer 4-minute 38-second version that circulated among OSINT analysts within 72 hours. Ukraine's general staff did not formally claim it. The HOR, which has publicly taken credit for prior naval drone strikes, said nothing on the record. That silence is itself a data point. We'll come back to why a successful operator might want to strike to stay quiet, but it means everything that follows has to be built from the imagery itself and from what can be cross-checked against independent sources. No press release is doing the work here. The pixels are. I spent the better part of 2 days going through the longer clip frame by frame, and one detail kept nagging at me before any of the cargo analysis even started: the horizon line. In the opening 90 seconds, the seeker is searching, panning across open water, and the thermal gradient where sea meets sky sits at a consistent angle that tells you the sensor's role and the vessel's heading. Cross-referenced against the only fixed reference in frame, a faint thermal bloom on the northern horizon consistent with the Crimean coast light signature, the geometry places the target in a corridor running south-southwest of the Kerch Strait approaches, not in open international water, not where a fishing fleet would work, in a lane that on paper Moscow has repeatedly described as cleared of military traffic. That corridor is where this investigation lands, and tracing it backward meant leaving the video for a while and going into the dull, unglamorous work that actually carries these investigations: shipping data. Every large vessel is supposed to broadcast its position over AIS, the automatic identification system, and platforms like Marine Traffic log those broadcasts. Russian naval auxiliaries routinely go dark. They switch the transponder off in operational areas, which is legal and expected. But transponders leave a shape even in their absence. You look for the gap. You find the last logged position before a vessel vanishes from the feed, and the first position after it reappears, and the straight line between them, divided by the elapsed time, gives you a speed and a heading that either fits a story or breaks it. Retention_checkpoint. 4 o'clock stakes bend, hand, and the AIS record threw up the first real obstacle. There was no clean track to follow. In the relevant window, 3 separate auxiliary vessels of broadly the tug class had gone dark in the same general approaches, their transponders winking out within a few hours of each other. Any of the 3 could have been our target. For most of a day, the investigation stalled on exactly this: a corridor we could prove but no name to hang on the hull, 3 candidate vessels, 1 piece of footage, and no way to bridge them. The break, when it came, did not come from satellite imagery or from Ukraine. It came from the Russian side, and it came by accident. A Russian mill blogger, one of the pro-war Telegram channels that report fleet movements with a candor the defense ministry finds embarrassing, posted then deleted within roughly 40 minutes a short note naming a specific tug as having been lost in the approaches that night. The note was archived by OSINT monitors before it came down, a routine practice now. Channels like Astra and analysts working with Bellingcat-style methods cache deletions precisely because deletions are confessions. We are not naming the vessel here because the public record on the name rests on a single deleted post and one is not enough. But the post did two things the footage alone could not. It collapsed 3 candidate hulls down toward one. And it confirmed that a Russian source writing for a Russian audience treated the night as a loss. Moscow's official line and Moscow's own war reporters were already telling different stories and only one of them had any reason to lie. Retention_checkpoint 7 o'clock microfinal cliffhanger. The corridor was mapped. The vessel class was fixed. The investigation on the navigation question was essentially closed. What it had not yet touched was the only question that ever mattered: what was on the deck? And the answer to that was sitting in plain sight, in 17 frames behind a layer of thermal noise that had to be peeled off one frame at a time. Most people assume thermal footage is too crude to read cargo. That is the common version, and it is wrong in one key respect. FLIR resolution is poor on absolute shape, but excellent on edges and on differential heat. A metal cylinder that has sat under sun on an open deck cools at a different rate than the wooden and steel structure around it, and that difference draws a clean thermal outline even when the daylight shape would be muddy. The strangest part of this whole case is that the very darkness the crew trusted is what made the cargo legible. 2 objects sit on the aft deck, lashed parallel, each running roughly the length you would expect of a shipping container's long axis, but narrower, cylindrical, capped, with a thermal signature suggesting a closed metal canister rather than open stores, netting, or the loose clutter of a working fishing boat. There are no fishing vessel tells in any frame, no booms, no reels, no gantry, no net drum. What's most surprising isn't that the objects are cylinders. It's how specific the cylinders are. Frame stepped and measured against the known beam of the tug class, a fixed reference because the hull width is in open shipbuilding records. The 2 objects come out at a length-to-diameter ratio that lands within the published envelope of the standardized transport and launch containers used for the Caliber family of cruise missiles. We overlaid the thermal edges against open-source Caliber container line drawings, the kind published in defense reference compendiums, and against daylight photographs of the same containers on quaysides. The match is not proof. We have to be exact about that, because the moment you overclaim on a thermal silhouette, you have stopped doing OSINT and started doing propaganda. The match is consistency. The cargo profile is consistent with 2 Caliber transport containers and is not consistent with the fishing gear Moscow named. Those are 2 different statements, and the second one is the stronger. Just retention_checkpoint 50% mid-roll hook. That brings us to the question this episode is really about, and one worth sitting with. If a thermal tape that nobody officially claimed can place restricted munitions in a corridor a government swears is empty, who do you believe and on what basis? That is not rhetorical. We genuinely want it in the comments. When a state denial and a deleted enemy post and 47 seconds of unattributed video all describe the same night, which one earns your trust and why? Put yourself at the analyst's desk for a second, with 3 sources that cannot all be true and a deadline, and decide what you would publish. This next part will probably draw some pushback. The most damaging thing about this strike was never the tug. Auxiliary tugs are cheap and replaceable, and one missing tow vessel does not bend a war. The damage was informational. By moving Caliber containers by sea at night through a corridor it had publicly declared clean, the Russian command was not just resupplying, it was betting that the cover of darkness still held. The Magura program had already proven, ship by ship, that it did not. The real failure belongs not to the tug's crew, who were following orders, but to a fleet command that kept routing high-value, deniable cargo through waters it had already lost the ability to defend at night, then built an official cover story flimsy enough to collapse under a single archived telegram post. That is a decision, not bad luck, and decisions have owners. Retention_checkpoint, controversial take plus viewer question placed. So how did the strike itself unfold, second by second? The longer recording lets you reconstruct it with a precision that earlier in this war would have been impossible. The first 90 seconds are search. The seeker pans, the horizon rolls gently, and there is nothing but cold water and that faint coastal bloom to the north. At roughly the 2-minute mark, the operator's view steadies. You can see it in the sudden stillness of the frame. The searching stops. Acquisition. A warm signature enters from the upper right, and the seeker pulls it towards center. From here, the geometry is a closing problem. The Magura runs in fast and low, and on thermal the target grows not gradually but in jumps, each jump a function of the closing rate. The lock indicator, visible as a stable box around the heat source, holds. It holds through a moment, at around 3 minutes 20, where the target's heading shifts by a few degrees. Not evasion, routine helm. The crew still does not know. There was a second obstacle here, and it is the kind that ends operations. Late in the run, for perhaps 4 seconds, the lockbox drifts off the hull and onto the warm wake astern, the engine exhaust and propeller turbulence throwing a heat plume that briefly outcompetes the cooler superstructure. On a lesser system, or with a slower operator, that is where the attack fails. You guide into the wake, you detonate in empty water, the tug sails on, and the cargo arrives. What the footage shows instead is a correction. The box snaps back onto the forward mass of the hull within roughly a second and a half. The kind of reacquisition that suggests either a sharp operator on the link or a terminal guidance routine doing exactly what it was designed to do. The distinction matters, and we can't resolve it from the video alone. Either way, the wake nearly saved the ship and didn't. The final 10 seconds are the part that is hard to watch in the way all of this work is hard, even rendered in nothing but green heat. The hull fills the frame. The 2 deck cylinders are at their most legible in the second-to-last clean frame, the very last detail before the geometry breaks down, which is exactly the delayed reveal this whole investigation was built around. Then white, then nothing. The recording does not show the aftermath because the platform carrying the camera ceases to exist at the moment of impact. There is no secondary explosion captured, no sympathetic detonation of the cargo on tape, and that absence is itself contested, because a cruise missile container's reaction to a shape-charged strike depends on whether a missile is loaded and armed, and nothing in the footage settles it. We note the absence, we do not fill it with a guess. A retention_checkpoint, approximately 14 min microfinal. The forensic aftermath splits into what Russia said and what the open-source record assembled around it. Within a day, the Russian Ministry of Defense addressed the night only obliquely, characterizing activity in the area as the interception of an unmanned craft and in a separate line picked up by state media describing damage to a fishing vessel, the phrase that runs through this entire story. There was no acknowledgement of a tug, no acknowledgement of cargo, no acknowledgement of the corridor. On the Ukrainian side, the formal silence held. No claim, no operator named, no unit cited. The Hichuars Group 13, the formation publicly associated with the naval drone campaign in earlier strikes, was not credited in any official statement, and we will not credit it here on inference alone. The unit behind this specific strike on the public record remains unnamed. What the OSINT community established in the days that followed was narrower and more durable than either government's framing. Analysts confirmed the deleted Russian Milblogger posts through cached copies. They confirmed the AIS gap that fit the corridor. They confirmed through hull class measurement that the target was not a fishing vessel. What they could not confirm, and several were careful to say so plainly, was the cargo's identity beyond consistent with. A few overreached and declared a confirmed caliber shipment. That is not what the evidence supports, and saying so is part of the job. The honest summary is the uncomfortable one. A Russian auxiliary tug, not a fishing boat, was carrying 2 cylindrical objects whose thermal profile matches cruise missile transport containers. Through a corridor Moscow declared clean and was destroyed there. Every clause in that sentence is supported. The clause Moscow most needed, that this was a civilian fishing incident, is the only one the evidence actively contradicts. There is a line I keep coming back to from the navigation work rather than the dramatic footage, and it has stuck with me more than the impact frame. The corridor we mapped, traced backward past the AIS gap, points toward a loading port on the Crimean coast, which means the cargo did not originate at sea. It was put on that deck by people, at a quay, in the hours before. Somewhere there is a manifest. Somewhere there is a crane operator, a loadmaster, a duty officer who signed for 2 cylinders and logged them as something. That paperwork exists on a server we cannot reach, and it would close this case in a single document. The footage gives us the end of the story. The beginning of it is sitting in a file cabinet in Sevastopol, a Rechan_checkpoint, approximately 21 min microfinal cliffhanger. We cut one thread from this episode because we could not stand it up on camera. A second, fainter heat source that appears in 3 early frames at the extreme edge of the seeker's field, well off the target's track, that some analysts read as a trailing escort and others as thermal artifact. If you've worked with flare data and have a read on it, that is the comment we will actually be reading. We didn't include it in the main reconstruction because one of the cardinal rules of this work is that you do not promote an ambiguous pixel to a fact just because it makes the story bigger. That restraint is the point. It would be easy to run this as a triumph, a clever drone, a beaten fleet, a caught lie. The truth underneath is colder and more useful. This single engagement, 12 nautical miles below the Kerch approaches on a moonless night, is a compressed model of how this entire war at sea has been fought and lost. A 5.5-meter machine that costs a fraction of the cargo it found, reading heat the dark was supposed to hide, against a fleet that kept betting on cover it no longer had. The tug was almost beside the point. What sank that night was a denial, the official version that the corridor was empty and the night was safe. The FLIR tape runs 4 minutes and 38 seconds, and somewhere in the middle of it, for 47 held seconds, you can watch a government story stop being true. If you want to see how the same instrument unmade an entire anchorage of warships before it ever found this tug, The Sergei Kotov reconstruction is where this campaign really begins.